It doesn't happen all at once. That is the first thing worth noticing about what power does to a person. There is no single moment where someone decides to become different. It happens gradually, in small increments, across a series of ordinary situations that each feel entirely reasonable at the time. Someone gets promoted. Or they are put in charge of something. Or they simply find themselves, over time, in a position where other people consistently defer to them, where their opinion carries more weight, where their mood shapes the atmosphere of a room, where people laugh a little more readily at their jokes and challenge them a little less readily on their ideas. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet shift in the texture of how interactions feel. And slowly, without any conscious decision, behavior begins to adjust. They interrupt more and notice less when they do. They speak with more certainty about things they were less certain about before. They find it slightly harder to hear feedback that contradicts what they already think. Small courtesies that came naturally before, the checking in, the asking how someone is doing, the genuine curiosity about another person's experience, start to require more effort. Not because they have become a bad person, but because the position has begun to do something to them that positions tend to do. The people around them notice before they do. That is almost always how it works. A colleague mentions something carefully and watches to see how it lands. A friend makes a joke that contains a small but real observation. A partner says quietly that something has shifted, that the person they are talking to is not quite the same as the person they remember. And the response, more often than not, is genuine surprise, because from the inside, the change is almost invisible. The person with power rarely experiences themselves as having changed. They experience themselves as simply responding to a world that has, quite reasonably, recognized what they are capable of. That gap, between how the change looks from the outside and how it feels from the inside, is where the most interesting and uncomfortable questions about power begin. Carl Jung would not ask you how you acquired the power. He would ask you what it is doing to the parts of yourself you are no longer paying attention to. Because that is what power does quietly and consistently to the people who hold it. It narrows the inner life without announcing that it is doing so. The person who once moved through the world with a degree of uncertainty, genuinely curious about other people, genuinely open to being wrong, genuinely aware of their own limitations, begins, almost imperceptibly, to lose contact with those parts of themselves. Not because they decided to, but because the position stopped requiring it. Jung believed that psychological health depends on a certain kind of tension. The tension between the ego, the conscious, presented self, and the deeper, less comfortable parts of the psyche that the ego would prefer not to examine too closely. Power, Jung observed, has a way of collapsing that tension. When the world consistently confirms your decisions, defers to your judgments, and organizes itself around your preferences, the inner voice that once asked whether you might be wrong becomes quieter. Not silenced. Just quieter. And quieter still, the longer the position holds. What moves into that space is the shadow. The parts of the self that power makes easier to act on without having to look at directly. The impatience that now expresses itself freely because the position makes it difficult for others to push back. The need for control that now has an entire structure available to satisfy it. The insecurity that doesn't disappear with power but finds new and more elaborate ways to protect itself, through the management of information, through the careful curation of who gets access, through the subtle but consistent rewarding of agreement and the subtle but consistent discouraging of challenge. Jung would ask you to notice what you have stopped questioning since you acquired the power you hold. Not as an accusation but as a genuine and important question. Because the shadow doesn't shrink when a person becomes powerful. It grows. It has more room to move, more tools available, and considerably less resistance to work against. And the person inside the position, surrounded by people who have learned that challenge is costly, may be the last one to see it clearly. Power, in Jung's understanding, doesn't reveal who a person really is. It reveals who a person becomes when the friction that once kept certain parts of themselves in check is quietly removed. Friedrich Nietzsche understood power not as something that corrupts from the outside, but as something that reveals from the inside. And what it most reliably reveals, he observed, is the story a person needs to tell about themselves, in order to feel that the power they hold is deserved. Because nobody with power experiences themselves as simply lucky or arbitrarily positioned. The story is always more ordered than that. More earned. The person at the top of the hierarchy didn't arrive there by accident, in their own telling. They arrived there because of something, their vision, their discipline, their willingness to make difficult decisions that others weren't capable of making. The position confirms the story, and the story justifies the position. And the two reinforce each other so consistently and so quietly that the person inside them rarely has reason to question either. Nietzsche called this the will to power. Not power in the crude sense of dominance or control, but the deeper drive toward the feeling of expansion. Of mattering, of being the kind of person whose decisions shape the world rather than being shaped by it. And what he observed is that once a person has access to that feeling, the story required to maintain it becomes increasingly important to protect. Because the story is not just about the position, it is about the self. And a threat to the story feels like a threat to the person. This is where power begins to quietly distort behavior in ways the person holding it almost never notices in themselves. The decision that serves the organization and the decision that protects the story start to look identical from the inside. The feedback that is genuinely useful and the feedback that is uncomfortable to hear become increasingly difficult to tell apart. The person who agrees with you starts to feel more intelligent than the person who challenges you. Not because you decided this, but because the story requires it. And the story, by this point, has been running long enough that it no longer feels like a story. It feels like the truth. Nietzsche would not ask you whether your power is deserved. He would ask you something considerably more uncomfortable. He would ask you to look at what you have become unwilling to hear since you acquired it. At the conversations that no longer happen around you. At the room that adjusts itself to your mood before you have said a single word. And then he would ask you whether the story you are telling about all of that is the honest one, or simply the most available one. Niccolò Machiavelli was not interested in what power does to the inner life of the person holding it. He was interested in what it does to their behavior. And what he observed, with the unsentimental precision he was known for, is that power changes behavior not because people become worse, but because the position makes certain behaviors more available and less costly than they were before. Before the power, consideration was practical. You needed people, you needed their goodwill, their cooperation, their willingness to work alongside you. And so you maintained the small courtesies that keep relationships functional. You listened, at least visibly. You acknowledged, at least occasionally. You managed the impression you made because the impression mattered to how well things went for you. Machiavelli would observe that much of what people call decency in ordinary life is also, quietly, a survival strategy. And when survival no longer requires it, it becomes optional in a way it never was before. This is what Machiavelli meant when he wrote about the prince who must know how to use both the lion and the fox. Force and cunning. The person with power doesn't always choose between them consciously. But the position makes both more available. And the longer someone holds power, the more naturally they reach for whichever tool the situation seems to require, without the friction of accountability that once made them pause. Michel Foucault watched all of this from a different angle entirely. He was not interested in what powerful individuals do. He was interested in what power itself does, to everyone inside the structure it organizes. Foucault observed that power doesn't only flow downward from the person at the top. It circulates. It shapes what feels normal and what feels impossible. It makes certain behaviors seem natural and others seem unthinkable, not through force, but through the quiet reorganization of what people expect, what they allow themselves to want, and what they learn not to say out loud. What this means, in practice, is that power changes the people around it as much as it changes the person holding it. The team that stops bringing problems because they have learned that problems are unwelcome. The colleague who adjusts their opinion before they have finished forming it because they already know which answer the room prefers. The culture that shapes itself around a single person's preferences so gradually that nobody can quite remember when it started or identify the moment they stopped pushing back. What Machiavelli and Foucault together point toward is something genuinely uncomfortable. Power doesn't need to announce itself to change everything around it. It only needs to be present long enough for everyone inside it to begin behaving as though certain things are simply how things are. And by the time that happens, the change is so complete that it has become invisible, to everyone in the room, and most of all to the person at the center of it.